Live stream. Got it.
Good. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Monsoon seminar. And this week we're being joined by Alex Webb from the University of Hong Kong. He's going to talk to us about the evolution of Himalayan tectonic models and their implications for the South Asian monsoon. I've had the pleasure of knowing Alex for some years now. We used to be colleagues at Louisiana State, and at the moment I'm in Hong Kong myself to do more monsoon and tectonic work with him. Alex did his first degree in Amherst, and he graduated from his PhD at University of California, Los Angeles, before he went first to Louisiana and then via Leeds, now to Hong Kong. So you know the general format here. If you would please mute and turn off your video, that's good. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll call on you at the end to answer your question. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex and he can begin his seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Peter. And thank you all for welcoming me to this wonderful seminar series. It's an honor to participate. This talk is based on collaborative work with a great many contributors for many years. I'm just listing a fraction of the recent team here, and it's still a lot of folks. The talk is going to be about how, despite our strong and long-standing first-order understanding of Himalayan tectonics, there's still a lot of debate over second-order tectonic issues in the Himalayan Tibetan system. And these debates matter for our understanding of solid earth forcing of the South Asian monsoon. So in service of addressing aspects of these debates, I'm going to show some examples of how field-based integrated tectonics explorations can advance our knowledge. And through this, we'll get up to date on tectonic climates models. Okay, let's get going. Okay, so the basics of Himalayan tectonics were articulated by the great Swiss geologist Emile Argand about 100 years ago. And it is pretty simple. India underthrusts Asia. So mountain building here would appear to be pretty straightforward. When plate tectonics came along, it didn't really bring fundamental changes to the picture. The Himalaya is a vast contractional origin. What was underthrusting became underthrusting in the context and understanding of subduction. So here are some of the more recent models that are applied to the Tibetan system in particular. So we have the classic underthrusting model in sort of the Powell and Connaughton form of complete underthrusting. And then B here is the Taponnier et al. 2001 model of some underthrusting and some jostling of microplates with oblique continental subduction. And then there's the classic, in C, you see the classic England and Hausman work with delamination and of a dense lithospheric root. And that, with Molnar's work on it in '93, we began to see potential implications for the monsoon development because Peter Molnar proposed that when we had this big delamination event in this model universe, this causes a rapid uplifting of the Tibetan plateau, which enhances atmospheric heating and can mess around with Hadley cells and thus intensify the South Asian monsoon. Model D here is the Clark and Royden stuff, mostly applied to Eastern Tibet with crustal flow in the middle crust, inflating the East Tibetan margin. Model E is something we're going to come back to in this talk. That's a model from our group, actually a paper that Peter and I worked on together, about how slab relative rollback, detachment, and detachment accomplished laterally may affect Himalayan mountain building. And model F is from the Dalhousie group, Chris Beaumont and Kelly, looking at a lot of potentially decoupling between the crust and mantle lithosphere of the blocks beneath Tibet, and a lot of shuffling around of those mantle lithospheric blocks and delamination of those and subduction of those. Okay, so that's a lot of variety within the context of India under thrusting Asia. If we look at the models that are applied more in the Himalayan context as opposed to the whole plateau context, then we have lithospheric scale models, and increasingly we have crustal scale models. So we have the original lithospheric scale under thrusting from Emil Argand, and then we have the plate tectonic version of the same. And then every other model shown here involves the South Tibet fault or the South Tibet detachment system. And so there's wedge extrusion either at lithospheric scale or at crustal scale. Imagine a pumpkin seed held between your fingers, it pops out. That's the basic kinematics of these models. The mechanics for wedge extrusion is various and sundry. There's a few different ideas. There's channel flow focused denudation, which is a highly popular model, started with Nelson in '96, Nelson et al. From seismic evidence, and then developed with a thermokinematic model from the Beaumont group. And that one does involve the monsoon again. This one invokes the monsoon as a driver for exhumation and uplift along the Himalayan topographic front. And then we have a couple of models that my group has been associated with, involving tectonic wedging with the South Tibet fault seen not as a normal fault, which it is in all of the other models, but rather as a back thrust. So shown in red here as a relatively flat back thrust. And then a later version of that involving development of the crystalline core of the Himalaya, the Greater Himalayan Crystalline Complex shown in pink here, as a duplex system as opposed to a ready-made block prior to this type of deformation. Okay, so that's a really the bird's eye view of some of these models, and we're going to get into testing them throughout some of this talk. I also want to talk about, in setting the stage here, a first order question of Tibet versus the Himalaya in generating the South Asian monsoon. So as I mentioned, Peter Molnar had developed this idea that atmospheric warming over the whole plateau can mess with Hadley cells enough to generate the monsoon. And Boos and Kwong here tried a different approach. They essentially made a computer model of the monsoon, and then they checked it against different topographic configurations. So this is their version of their compilation of the data that illustrates the monsoon, that represents it. And so they are defining the monsoon in terms of its wind speeds, shown in the green arrows, and its amounts of precipitation, shown in the color bands. And this is their computer model of the current topography, current coastlines, etc. And they do a pretty decent job of reproducing the monsoon. Then in this second model right here, they remove all topography and promptly remove the monsoon also. And in this last model, they bring back all topography except for that of the Tibetan Plateau. So they maintain the Himalayan topographic front, but the Tibetan Plateau hinterland is gone. And what they see is essentially the same pattern as when they had the Tibetan Plateau hinterland. So the presence or absence of the Tibetan Plateau does not turn out in their modeling to be all that critical to the generation of the monsoon, orographic forcing instead appears to dominate. So that is an alternative model to that earlier Molnar model. Okay, so let's explore the basic structural geology of the Himalaya and consider what it tells us about some of these various models. So these first two sections are simply top results from Googling. And it's just an attempt to show a pretty typical Himalayan cross-section. And we're going to tackle this cross-section and the Himalaya in general, fault by fault, and see what we can learn about the models along the way. Eventually, we're going to see that we need to think in 3D, and we need to consider the dynamic mantle evolution. These models are, obviously not doing this. This is really typical for a Himalayan cross-section. The mantle isn't really considered in terms of its whole form, but rather as a static boundary condition of continued convergence. But we are going to end up considering the mantle and its impact on crustal development and on topography, and thus on the monsoon, and then we'll wrap up. So to start fault by fault, let's note that the major claimed faults bounding imbricate slices in these sort of typical Himalayan cross sections are the main frontal thrust at the south, the main boundary thrust, the main central thrust, the South Tibet fault or the South Tibet detachment system. And those are the faults we're going to walk our way through to start with. So we're going to start also by situating ourselves in a regional geological map. And it's going to be in this position across the Himalaya and southern Tibet. So here's the map. And here's a section adapted from recent literature. You can see a few more complications shown in this section. Internal structures are hinted at. And admittedly, these are pretty well known for the Lesser Himalaya, and a more recent discovery in terms of these internal structures shown in the Greater Himalayan crystallines. Yet this cross-section doesn't show a fault that the other two sections do show. This cross-section does not include the main boundary thrust. So the other sections, this MBT, is this main boundary thrust, which is thought to be a major tectonic division between pre-Himalayan Lesser Himalayan rocks and syndeformational sub-Himalayan rocks. And so I want you to note that there's an implicit equality here in this definition between structural and stratigraphic division. And from a structural geology perspective, it's rarely wise to equate those two because structures cut up and down section. But nonetheless, in most Himalayan simple frameworks, we do equate those two, and it leads to problems. And you'll see some of those along the way through the talk. So in short, I'm going to argue there is no main boundary thrust. And let me show you why. And it's easier to show you why in this area that's highlighted here in the Western Himalaya. So let's look at just this one example of the Himalayan front course of the main boundary thrust and see how it's very difficult to back that definition up and have a single major structure. So this cross section here is this line of section right here. So from southwest to northeast, southwest to northeast. And we're going to zoom in a little bit. So here is the zoomed in map, zoomed in portion of the cross section. And what I've dashed in this fluorescent green color are two different branches of what would be considered a main boundary thrust. So here we have Lesser Himalayan rocks in blue, thrust over some Himalayan rocks in pinks and oranges and yellows along this Kroll thrust version of the main boundary thrust. And that fault occurs right here in the cross section. And then here we have this Bilaspur thrust version, which occurs here in the cross section. And they're two different faults. They don't link up. One of them has a massive amount of shortening along it. The Kroll thrust has, 50 to 100 kilometers of shortening. The Bilaspur thrust doesn't necessarily have anywhere near that much. One is way above the other. So they both fit the technical definition of the main boundary thrust. They both are putting Lesser Himalayan rocks atop thin preserved strips of lower sub-Himalaya. So it's much more effective to recognize that the Lesser Himalaya and the sub-Himalaya are a sheared stratigraphy that are deformed into a full thrust belt without any one fault dominating their juxtaposition. And Sean Long and Dee Robinson, they implicitly made a pretty similar point in a geology paper from last year. So there's no one main boundary thrust. There's many thrusts accomplishing this, and they have very different natures along strike. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the main central thrust. Similarly, this structure is also not as singular as our common cross sections would lead us to believe. So the recognition of faults within the crystalline core of the origin, which are progressively younger at progressively deeper structural positions, leads to a classic duplex interpretation. So slices were apparently progressively accreted from the downgoing Indian footwall, forming the crystalline core and its internal thrust faults. So note that the normal consequences of duplex development apply to the main central thrust itself. That is, in the hinterland, where the duplex is developed, it records its history in fragments. Each strand has a progressively younger part of the main central thrust history. And all of that history is compounded into one strand towards the front of the model. So here you have fractions of the history in each strand, and all of those are condensed along the leading portion of the main central thrust. So it's complex. What is the main central thrust based on where you are? So this is how folks like Aaron Martin would like to describe the Tons thrust as part of the main central thrust, and that's sort of true. The point is that the whole origin is formed by progressive accretion, which is much like other full thrust belts around the world. And the apparent big blocks of the classic sections are not so structurally distinguishing as we commonly like to assume. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the South Tibet Fault. So here are the models that are most popular these days for seeking to explain activity on the South Tibet Fault. It's supposed to be a huge normal fault, and that's true in all of the models except for ours, where we show it as a back thrust. Note that it's recognized to have two fairly distinct elements, an upper and a lower South Tibet Fault. The lower fault is a warped shear zone, and the upper fault is somewhat more discrete and appears to dip to the north and cut the ductile shear zone and or locally coincide with the ductile shear zone. That one looks substantially much more like a normal fault in this particular design of our understanding, in this model of our understanding for the South Tibet Fault. So something I want to look at here is the South Tibet Fault along strike, because normal faults should have thermochronometric signatures, and we can look for those. So the footwall should have much younger cooling ages than the hanging wall, but the South Tibet Fault doesn't match that in most places. So here are mostly Muscovite ages for central Nepal, and these open circles are Muscovite ages for northwestern Indian Himalaya along the Sutlej River transect. And in both cases, the ages spanning the fault are nearly identical. So this suggests not a dipping fault. This suggests a relatively flat fault, which is possible for normal faults, but it's also possible for for thrust faults. It simply suggests a décollement. Here, farther east in Bhutan, things look a bit different. Here, the South Tibet footwall has a very dramatic late rapid cooling event from temperatures way higher than those ever seen in the hanging wall. And so this does do a pretty good job of matching the expected normal fault thermochronometric signal in the East Central Himalaya. Also, distinctly here, a sharp brittle contrast is observed. A sharp fault is observed juxtaposing rocks of very different grade. So this appears to be an expression of the upper South Tibet Fault as articulated in the cross section here of that upper strand. Now, it's interesting to note that most maps do not distinguish the upper and lower South Tibet Fault. And here we only partially do. We sort of dash in, and I'll make it a little more clear in a second when I get rid of these markers showing you where we are. We dash in this upper fault shown in white on the map, but for the most part, we show it coincident with the lower fault. And in many cases it is, but more to the point, the problem is that it's pretty hard to map it along strike. If you try mapping along the Himalayan range crest, it's challenging. So it's pretty much impossible to walk these faults. You can only cross them in a few transects. Nonetheless, the differing thermochronometric signals along the strike indicate that this upper South Tibet Fault, it appears limited to the region between Everest and Bhutan. We don't see anything quite like it anywhere farther to the west or to the east. So whereas the lower South Tibet Fault, that occurs all across the range. And later on, we'll come back to this to try and understand this distinction. So let's look back at the dominant tectonic models again. They're mostly having normal faults. So we have the main faults being the main central thrust and then the overlying South Tibet Fault acting as a normal fault. And from the early to middle Miocene, we should have this 3-layer, 2-fault package in the models that include the South Tibet Fault as a normal fault. So you should be going from lesser Himalaya, crossing the main central thrust, to exposed, eroding greater Himalayan crystallines in the early and middle Miocene, and then across the South Tibet Fault as a normal fault, and into the Tethyan Himalaya. So low grade, high grade, low grade for the most part, 3 layers, 2 faults. And that would be similar in this model and in this model. And so the range generally supports this. If we look at the geology, say across here, you go lower unit, high grade unit, lower grade unit, 1, 2, 3 units, 2 faults. But as we move farther to the west, that seems to break down. Here we have the higher unit thrust directly across the lower unit. So this is where we look to try and see what are the overall geometries of these layers, and might they actually be in this kind of a situation such that we could test these models. because these models predict that any leading edge of the high-grade rocks was eroded away a long time ago. This model predicts that maybe you could still preserve the leading edge of the high-grade rocks. So we look back to the Northwest Indian Himalaya. We've seen this map before. We've seen this cross-section before. So this is a compilation map of a lot of previous work and a lot of our field mapping, augmented by a lot of analytical work, particularly to show, and you'll see some of this later, that all of these rocks are contiguous around here. What we find is that the two faults do indeed merge here. So this simplified cross-section is consistent with the geology here. Here's the fancier cross-section, the more realistic one. In both cases, that gray arrow is pointing to the intersection up dip of the South Tibet Fault with the main central thrust. So that preservation here, here, and here of the leading edge of those two faults, their merger, is consistent with this duplexing model. And it makes it hard to imagine that the leading edge of the greater Himalayan crystallines were eroded away in the earlier Middle Miocene. So having discovered that critical geometric relationship here, we looked for it elsewhere along strike. This is what we found. So in these areas, we've mapped and published constraints showing those two faults merging. There's some unpublished interpolation from the literature here and here, and some unpublished work here. Essentially, it seems like this leading edge merger exists all along the strike of the Himalaya, and thus it supports this model along the strike of the Himalaya. Okay, so I imagine that given the monsoonal interest of this community, a lot of the people watching this talk and trying to learn about the tectonics will actually know a lot about sedimentary records, far more than me. But I do know one thing that is common to the interpretation of the sedimentary records of the Himalayan origin, which is that many people think that the crystalline core of the origin does indeed exhume to the surface in the early and middle Miocene, which is consistent with the channel flow model and with the wedge extrusion model, but is not consistent with this model. This model wants to have those rocks buried in the early middle Miocene. So how are we going to square the circle? Essentially, I'm going to argue that the Foreland and Fan records do not confirm erosion of the greater Himalayan crystallines at this time. So let me show you the argument. Before I dive into this, I want to point out that this is a bit of a rehash versus Yin 2006. I'll show you some data subsequent to that, but you can use data from before, or which he does. This paper is cited like crazy, but I don't think a lot of people actually read it because it's commonly cited to support things like the three-layer two-fault stack or the simple geometries I showed you earlier. This is not a review paper. This paper is a revolution. This detrital analysis is part of this paper. It's done in a different way, but pretty similar in this paper. So I recommend it. Okay, first, how are we going to tell when the greater Himalayan crystallines breaches the surface? One way would be geochemistry. Another would be detrital zircons. All right, so here's just one of the records you could pick. I picked it because it's fresh in my brain because this happens to be one I did, but there's lots of similar data out there. So we have detrital zircons on the left. We have strontium versus neodymium on the right. And how it breaks down is that lower Tethyan rocks boxed in green, greater Himalayan crystalline rocks boxed in pink, and some of the late Proterozoic levels of the lesser Himalaya boxed in blue, they all show fairly similar patterns of a fair amount of detritus that is the early part of the Neoproterozoic, and then maybe this peak back here, some 1.8 showing up. Whereas the deeper portions, the Mesoproterozoic and Paleoproterozoic parts of the Lesser Himalaya have a very different pattern in the detrital zircons, and similarly a very different pattern in strontium neodymium space. These all cluster together, and that's separate. So it doesn't seem that the tectonic units are controlling the geochemistry of the detrital zircons. It seems that the age of the units is controlling these aspects. And indeed, it's increasingly thought that the late Proterozoic rocks in all of these different units represent a single contiguous layer prior to deformation. So geochemistry and detrital zircons are not going to be telling you if the greater Himalayan crystallines are at the surface. And if you read a paper that argues that they are, you know enough to know that you can discount that conclusion. Okay, what about metamorphic grade? This is the obvious difference in the field, right? The greater Himalayan crystallines are super high grade, and the lesser Himalayan and the Tethyan Himalaya are supposed to be very low grade. But in fact, the greater Himalayan crystallines are only a little bit hotter. So they are significantly hotter, but only a little bit hotter than the uppermost portions of the lesser Himalaya and vast swaths of the lower Tethyan Himalaya. So what you can see here is the same map, but just in terms of metamorphic grade. And there's garnet grade rocks shown in pink all along the base of the Tethyan Himalaya through here. And there's also a lot of granitic intrusions there. So a lot of people try to use feldspar and garnet to tell when the greater Himalayan crystallines show up in the Foreland or Fan records. And that's not going to cut it when such a vast portion of the Tethyan Himalaya actually would be providing those same minerals. The only truly distinctive minerals, at least in terms of bulk volumes of these units, are going to be the highest grade. So you got to look for kyanite and selimanite with these type of protoliths, with these muddy protoliths. And so when we do that, they show up a lot later than you might expect. So to sell it all, it's been long known from the central Himalaya that kyanite and selimanite are showing up there at about 11 MA. And in the northwestern Indian Himalaya, they're showing up even a little bit later, something, 8 MA or younger. And I understand that the Indus and Bengal fans show something similar. So those highest grade minerals are suggesting a late Miocene or younger exposure, or just before the late Miocene exposure of these high grade rocks, which would be consistent with them being at depth for the bulk of the early and middle Miocene. All right, so whichever model you prefer, what we've done is we've gotten ourselves up to about 2015, 2016, at which point you have these models shown here as the set of models under dominant consideration by the Himalayan community and by our group. However, there are two big issues for all of these models, including all of our work up to that point. One is that they ignore mantle dynamics, except as a kinematically invariant convergent boundary condition. So yes, there is convergence, there is subduction, but it is treated as a background boundary condition that is pretty invariant, it just keeps going. Maybe it slows down progressively and subtly, and that would be about the extent to which we are considering it. Secondly, geological records show dramatic third-dimensional variability in these major structures, particularly the South Tibet Fault, but these are all 2D models. So these 2D models can't explore that. So let me show you some of this variability. So this is a messy looking plot, but I guarantee you it makes sense. It is an interpolation of the timing of cessation of motion along the South Tibet Fault. So this gray band is showing when the South Tibet Fault stopped moving. Okay, so let's unpack it. Our x-axis is longitude. So this is the Western Himalaya, this is the Central Himalaya, this is the Eastern Himalaya. Our y-axis is time. So from 26 MA to 8 MA, so moving forwards, downwards. And the data on here are almost exclusively from leucogranites, so uranium, thorium, lead ages of monazites and zircons from deformed and undeformed leucogranites, and also argon muscovite. So the leucogranite dating works as follows. You can see this picture. It's a classic example of leucogranite dating within the South Tibet Fault zone. The shear zone can be up to 1 kilometer thick or so. So within the shear zone, leucogranites either intruded during or prior to deformation or post-deformation. So here's an example of a leucogranite that intrudes either before or during deformation. And this leucogranite here is cross-cutting the foliation. So it must postdate the deformation, at least in that segment of the thick shear zone. It's possible to cross-cut deformation in some of the shear zone and have, say, an upper or lower portion of the shear zone continuing to shear. So it's not a total bracket on when the shear zone ceased motion, unless you can get a leucogranite to cross the entire shear zone. Some have argued this. I find the evidence equivocal. In my view, there's no leucogranite that crosses the entirety of the shear zone, but it's debatable. Okay, so given that information, let's look at the data. The greens are pre or synkinematic ages. So these are ages of when the fault was active or before the fault was active. And the reds are post-fault motion ages from leucogranites, so an age like from that dike, and the oranges are post-fault motion ages as inferred from argon muscovite ages. Now, argon muscovite can have excess problems, so some of those could be a little extra old, but in the main, they will be younger than fault motion. That seems to be consistent for the ductile shear zone of the South Tibet Fault. Okay, so there's a lot of caveats. Plus, it looks like a shotgun, right? It looks like a scatter plot. But the key ones are the youngest limit of the green ages, of the pre or syn deformation ages. And another aspect of this scatter plot is that the plot suffers from the same weakness as the Concordia diagram. The larger the data appears, the larger the error is, right? So the smallest data points on this plot are the strongest ones, and that can be visually counterintuitive. So with all of that said, you can interpolate, especially from the youngest limit of the green ages, as it were, when the fault ceased motion. There's only two green data that we sort of ignore, single data points. For the most part, it's extremely robust through the central Himalaya, very robust through the western Himalaya, and really not that well constrained in the eastern Himalaya, that there is a change in the cessation of South Tibet timing, such that it stops motion in the western Himalaya quite early, in the central Himalaya, progressively younger and younger and younger to about 90 degrees east, after which it's unclear. So that's about a 10 million year age swing in when the South Tibet Fault ceases motion. And yet our models for the South Tibet Fault are all two-dimensional, but this is all a long strike age swing. So we need more sophisticated models to handle this kind of a difference in the fault behavior. All right. So interestingly, shallow, intrusive, and volcanic rocks in southernmost Tibet show a similar trend. There's the same trends of younging to the east central Himalaya from the far east and from the west. We could get into detrital records, but I don't think we have a lot of time. Suffice it to say, they're going to have similar trends in detrital records in the Foreland Basin of argon muscovite and zircon fission track ages, as shown here. And I guess you can check the source or ask me questions after if you want to get into this in detail. So in order to try and find something to explain why we would have these long strike changes when all of our crustal models don't bother, we looked at the mantle. And so we looked at mantle records and found something interesting. This is Anne Repluma's work looking at seismic tomography. And so she's showing slices from the western Himalaya to the central Himalaya, down about halfway through the mantle. And the blue spots are relatively fast seismic wave speeds interpreted as detached portions of lithosphere. And so the Tethyan anomaly is supposed to be broken off in the initial collision, 50, 60 MA in those kind of models. And the Indian anomaly is supposed to be broken off about 25, 20 million years ago. But something that Anne and her colleagues noted is that in the west, the Indian anomaly is entirely below the 660 discontinuity, shown as this dashed line. But as we move to the central Himalaya, it's higher and higher. And their interpretation was that it has had less time to fall, so that it detached later, such that the slab detachment propagated from the west earlier to the center later. So that is, it temporally correlates very nicely with the cessation of South Tibet faulting and with the lateral propagation seen in the magmatic ages. Okay, so this is the model that we generate out of this, and we saw this model in an all blue form earlier. This is a very odd way of looking at the Himalaya, so let me talk you through it. First, imagine you're in Beijing, but maybe like 500 kilometers above Beijing, and you can see really well. You can see back at the Himalaya from that vantage point, and you can see through Tibet, through the upper plate, to the downgoing plate, okay? And finally, it's 15 million years ago. So what we see here is the Western Himalaya to the Eastern Himalaya, 15 million years ago, and you see a slab detaching here and a tear propagating inwards and another tear in the east propagating inwards. So as these slab tears propagate, they cause isostatic, dynamic topographic, and tectonic changes to the crustal convergence orogenic system developing above. So this would permit progressive shutoff of South Tibet fault activity. It would trigger South Tibet magmatism via an influx of hot material through the slab tear gaps. And there would be uplift, exhumation, and cooling as the weight of the downgoing slab and the associated mantle flow tractions are removed via the breakoff. So very specifically, the model is predicting mountain topographic growth from 25 to 12 MA. And this growth zippers in from the ends of the Himalaya to the east central Himalaya. Okay, so before I keep going, I want to make a quick comparison. It should make this a little bit more accessible. So at right is the basic form of the 3D tectonic model that I just showed you. And at left, you may very well recognize a similar model from Vordel and Spackman for Mediterranean tectonics and Alpine tectonics. And you'll see that this model, it may be really weird for the Himalaya, but if you have some familiarity with other orogenic systems, this kind of slab detachment and lateral propagation of tearing is actually something that's been considered for roughly 20 years. So you could argue we're a bit behind the times. I've certainly chided myself for this. Okay, so if you want to dive really hardcore into the tectonic details, this is not the talk for you. But you can check out these papers. So we go through how exactly this lateral propagation of slab detachment would be inferred to affect the crustal dynamics. Essentially, it's a critical taper type of approach. And, I have versions of this in this published paper here that are incredibly documented. So you can get into the weeds as you like. This paper here explores how the rollback and detachment would impact the subsidence followed by rapid exhumation that formed the Kailash Basin and shows similar histories just a bit earlier for the Gangdesi batholith to the north of the Kailash Basin. So the tectonic weeds are available to you, the tectonic details, second and third order, but we're not going to dwell on them today. Instead, the last thing we're going to do in this talk is we're going to look at how this model, and particularly the mountain growth associated with it, could imply things for the South Asian monsoon. Okay, so the basic story is we looked at that Busan Kwong paper earlier, and they're arguing that if you have the mountains, you have the monsoon, and if you don't have the mountains, you don't have the monsoon. And later work from that same group shows a damn near linear correlation with increasing orography means increasing monsoon strength. So this model is predicting an increase in orography. It's predicting with the slab detachment that there's going to be a progressive increase in orography in Himalayan topography from 25 to 12 MA. So it therefore is predicting with this rise in topography a similar prediction in terms of a monsoon intensification across that same period. So would that we had excellent monsoon proxy data. We do not. The proxy records for the monsoon strength remain pretty fragmentary. We have all kinds of problems with stuff like river capture. Nonetheless, generally what we do have shows strengthening of the monsoon through the proposed 25 to 12 MA period. So here are some records from the Pearl River Delta, which you could say is sort of on the margin of the monsoonal system, but is a relatively stable system through the period of interest, such that maybe we don't have to worry about river capture. And what it shows is from about 25 MA to the 10 to 15 million year period in which we expect final slab detachment to occur, we have a strengthening of the monsoon in these monsoon proxy records, with the exception of the global mid-Miocene climatic optimum. Okay, so the model prediction is met to the extent that we have the necessary data, or that we have any data on the evolution of the monsoon. I hope that this may spur this community, especially through this talk, to try and really focus on getting monsoon proxy records somehow from the 25 to 10 million year period, because it would really help test this model better. All right, so let's finish up with some takeaway points. I want to start by acknowledging that we've known the first order tectonics here for roughly 100 years, thanks to Emile Argand. However, there's just so much debate on the second order features, our view is that there's too much going on in 3 dimensions and at mantle depths for us to understand the crustal tectonics without simultaneously considering the mantle dynamics. And so the spatio-temporal association of South Tibet fault activity, South Tibet volcanism, crustal exhumation, and lateral propagation of slab detachment suggests that these are interrelated. And so the model that we present here, this one, it represents one possible interpretive framework for such interrelated processes. It is the first Himalayan model to explore these processes in the 3rd dimension. So we can assume there will be better models along the way. I think the major takeaway point is that they are required if we're going to really explore the South Tibet fault, and that's going to be a central component of our tectonic models. That thing is stopping motion with a 10 million year age swing. That cannot be explained with 2-dimensional models. Okay, and so when we look at the implications of this model for the monsoon, particularly in light of the Boos and Kwong work, the model suggests that there should be a strengthening of the South Asian monsoon from 25 to 12 MA, and that strengthening is consistent with the admittedly weak data that we have available to us. Okay, so with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and should you have any questions, here I am.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. So let's see if we have any questions. If you do have any, please put them in the chat box here. So, Alex, what I wanted to ask you was something that we've been worried about for a while, really, about this exposure of the Greater Himalayas. So you think that, I mean, what's your favorite mineral for being diagnostic of that? Kyanite?
Kyanite and selimanite. I mean, I have never done that kind of work, right? So
No.
This is all a literature analysis for me. But if we look at, let's look at this more regionally. I showed you an example for just this area where there's good reason to understand that this whole portion of the main central thrust hanging wall is in fact Tethyan, and most of it is garnet grade, and most of it has early Paleozoic granitoids within it. So if you're going to track exhumation of the Greater Himalayan crystallines via garnet and via feldspar showing up in your detrital record, we can produce those in abundance from the base, from the lower portions of the Tethyan Himalaya. And the Tethyan Himalaya here, that lower portion is 5 kilometers or so thick. The Greater Himalayan crystallines here are only 6, 7, 8 kilometers thick. So there's not a great substantial difference in their thickness. Similarly, if you look in the cross-sectional view, that basal Tethyan stuff is going to dominate what's been eroded away in the past, because you're ahead of this branch line, and the branch line is extending across the front middle of the range now. So in the past, it would have been, you know, deeper back in the range, and you'll have much more of that leading edge, which we interpret the Lesser Himalayan crystalline naps of the Tethyan material to be eroded to provide those garnets and feldspars. However, the lowermost Tethyan has extremely little kyanite and selimanite. There is some in contact metamorphic aureoles, and at the very, very base of the Tethyan, say here, there's arguably some. In places where it's hard to know if you're really in the Tethyan or you're within the fault zone or whatever. So there shouldn't be a lot of kyanite and selimanite supplied. Everything else should be damn near the same because it's the same protoliths. The late Proterozoic, the Neoproterozoic Tethyan is the same protoliths as the Neoproterozoic Greater Himalayan crystallines, which dominates the Greater Himalayan crystallines. So the only thing that appears to distinguish them in the detrital record is kyanite and selimanite.
Okay.
And the volumes should be comparable also. So then, yeah, that's why I showed those kyanite and selimanite records here, one from your paper and one from this classic Tissell paper, where kyanite and selimanite are showing up only at 11 MA in the Nepal Himalaya, and even younger in the Northwest Indian Himalaya. For anybody old enough, like ourselves, to have been at the 2004 GELSOC meeting on channel flow, this was the signal event of the 3rd day, when the entire community all of a sudden realized that kyanite and selimanite were going to be the only way to tell those two, the lower Tethyan from the greater Himalayan crystallines apart in the Forlin and Fan records. And of course, few of us knew the answer off the top of our heads in the room, and all heads swiveled towards Pete DeSell. And Pete did not want to be on the spot on this issue, but nonetheless had to answer that he only sees kyanite and sillimanite at 11 MA and not earlier. So this should be heralded as a real discriminatory feature separating when you have Tethyan erosion versus when you have Tethyan plus greater Himalayan crystalline erosion. But I think that there's still a dominance of looking to garnets and feldspars and thinking that that's greater Himalayan crystallines. Still even a dominance of looking to the classic Neoproterozoic detroidal zircons and thinking that that's greater Himalayan crystallines. But similar rocks occur in 3, 4, 5 kilometer thick sections in the lesser Himalaya. And we have reason to believe that they would have been a larger fraction of the eroded lesser Himalaya than they are of the current lesser Himalaya. And similarly, 5 kilometer sections in the Tethyan Himalaya.
I mean, presumably the exposure wouldn't be synchronous along the mountains anyway, right? It would be, you expect it to be older in the west and younger in the east.
There's that classic thought that everything is more progressed in the east than it is in the west. I have some arguments about that. So for instance, let me see if I can find the right place here. Yeah, okay. We could dig into this a little bit. We envision the growth of the greater Himalayan crystallines by basal accretion during Himalayan orogenesis. So a common thought is that the greater Himalayan crystallines were some sort of a block before the growth of the mountains, and they're just, exhumed as that block later. They're deformed as that block later. But our understanding is contrary to that. Our understanding would be that the uppermost portion of the greater Himalayan crystallines represents the basal portion of the earlier Tethyan full thrust belt from the Eo-Himalayan stage. And then everything subsequently is scraped off of the downgoing plate as a slice. And that's consistent with, say, Matt Cohn's work and a lot of other folks showing a downwards progression of younging through the greater Himalayan crystallines, plus some discrete shear zones throughout the greater Himalayan crystallines that makes it look just basically like a duplex. So if the greater Himalayan crystallines is not a block, but is rather a duplex that grew during the deformation, then our thought about its overall dynamics is pretty different. So what we see here is that we envision the growth of that duplex to be controlled in large part by critical taper dynamics. You need to accrete at depth if you're trying to thicken your wedge in a critical taper system, which you would probably have to do if the basal décollement is dipping steeply, which would likely happen if you have a slab attached pulling down on everything. Your basal décollement is steepening through time. As soon as you release it, then the basal décollement will rise up like everything else. That's part of the topographic growth we expect to occur once you have the slab detachment. And so then it's going to shut off the duplexing. So when we look along strike in the Himalaya, the greater Himalayan crystallines thicken. They're quite thin over here. They're only 6, 7 kilometers thick, and they thicken progressively to something like a minimum of 20 kilometers, 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers thick over here. And our understanding of that would be that the slab detachment occurs far later in the east. So the slab is pulling down and requiring thick accretion for a longer period in the east, building up a thicker greater Himalayan crystalline complex. And that it's thinner in the west because it didn't duplex for as long, it didn't accrete for as long. So it's just a thinner section.
So Alex, correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm hearing you say a lot about how the solid earth and the uplift of the mountains may have influenced the monsoon.
Yep.
But do you think that exposure of things like the greater Himalaya crystallines is at all that there's a reverse there where because obviously you're not a fan of channel flow. So do you think the surface processes that are controlled by the monsoon have any part to play here in exposing those deeper units?
Chicken, whose egg? I'm not a deep reader in some of the literature on that, but it does seem to me that a fair amount of such literature thinks that tectonics are doing what it's going to do, irrespective of some of the erosional processes. My understanding is that you have you're going to have the topographic front anyways, but slab dynamics is a pretty powerful driver, right? And the associated tractions of mantle flow, and they're not incorporated in models until this one. We can see a lot of correlations in the timing of the detachment with things like the thickening of this duplex, with things like the cessation of South Tibet fault motion, which we couldn't really access with the monsoon, but it would be potentially, it's a very specific ask of the monsoon to diminish progressively from west to east to allow a similar shutoff to occur. Right?
Okay.
So I think that the correlations are, I'm saying correlations causation here. The correlations are suggestive that the slab processes and mantle flow processes are controlling a substantial fraction of the tectonics. And there is a strong prediction that there's an uplift because of the slab detachment, which gives a very specific timing estimate, which is a pretty good fit to what limited monsoon proxy data we have. So it is sensible within that context to envision mantle dynamics as a cause of monsoonal intensification, and rather than a lot the other way around.
Okay.
So the channel flow model, for instance, requires calling upon the monsoon to drive its significant exhumation phase, to drive the transition from the tunneling phase to the exhumation phase. There is nothing in this tectonic model that requires calling upon the monsoon. There is, one major prediction out of it that suggests a driver for monsoon activity that is consistent with data thus far, that is currently viable.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to ask a question?
Something in the chat. Oh, that's you.
No, it's just me asking for questions.
Okay. Something else I wanted to mention, I just forgot, is that I will check periodically. I'll check the YouTube comments to see if there's questions in there that somebody wants an answer to.
Cool. Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, I hope people will join me in thanking you for your presentation, either
Thank you.
virtually or in using your webcam. I'd like to encourage people to come back next week. Next week, we're hearing from Clara Bolton from Serge in France. And due to a quirk of the schedule, she'll be talking at this time and not in the other schedule. So you can come back at the same time next week to listen to Clara Bolton talk about paleoceanography. And I forgot exactly what her title is, but you'll be getting an email from me within a day or two about that. But anyway, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye for now.